In the golden light of a late Athenian afternoon, the city hummed, not just with the clatter of chariots or the shouts of merchants, but with the sound of ideas colliding. This was Athens at its zenith, temples rising from the Acropolis, philosophers debating in the Agora, triremes guarding the sea lanes of an empire. But beneath the marble and the rhetoric, a quieter revolution was brewing, one not of swords, but of satire. And its first spark came from a man named Aristophanes. Born around 446 BCE to a landowning family, perhaps in the coastal deme of Cydathenium, he was not a philosopher, not a general, not a statesman. He was a poet of the absurd, a weaver of words so sharp they could cut through pride like a blade through silk. Little is known of his early life. No statues survive. No self-portraits. Only his plays, 11 of them, miraculously preserved, speak for him. What shaped him? The city itself. Athens in the mid-5th century was a paradox, a democracy that enslaved thousands, a beacon of reason that worshipped a god of wine and madness, Dionysus. Every spring, the city paused for the city Dionysia, a festival where tragedy reigned for days. And then, on the final day, comedy was unleashed. This was not comedy as we know it. It was old comedy raw, obscene, fearless. Actors wore padded bellies and grotesque phalluses. Choruses danced in animal costumes. And the playwright? He stood not in the wings, but behind the masked shadow with a voice. Aristophanes debuted in 427 BCE, with the banqueters now lost, but his second play, The Babylonians, 426 BCE, changed everything. Staged before an audience that included foreign allies of the Athenian Empire, it mocked the city's corrupt tribute collectors. The backlash was swift. The populist demagogue Cleon the leather tanner turned general, famed for his fiery oratory, and ruthless ambition dragged Aristophanes before the Council of 500, accusing him of slandering the city before strangers. He was only in his 20s. His career could have ended before it began, but he did not retreat. Instead, he sharpened his pen. In 425 BCE, he returned with The Acharnians, a play so bold it felt like treason. Its hero, Dicaeopolis, a weary farmer, declares a personal peace treaty with Sparta, while Athens is still at war. He trades wine and figs with the enemy, mocks warmongers, and sings. War benefits only arms dealers and demagogues. Peace feeds children. The audience roared. The judges awarded first prize. Cleon fumed. Aristophanes had discovered his power. Laughter could wound deeper than a spear. He followed it with The Knights, 424 BC, a direct, blistering assault on Cleon himself. In it, the Athenian people are portrayed as an old, gullible man, Demos, the people, manipulated by a vulgar, lying slave named Paphlagonione, transparent stand-in for Cleon, complete with his raspy voice and habit of kissing Demos' backside. The play opened with the Corsa group of horsemen, the elite cavalry class that despised Cleon's singing. Here comes the Paphlagonian. Lear, thief, flatterer of the mob, Cleon tried to stop the performance. He failed. The play won first prize. And when Cleon was later killed in battle at Spectaria, many whispered, Aristophanes struck the first blow. But war does not end with one man's death. It deepens. It corrupts. And in 430 BCE, a new horror arrived, the plague. It swept through Athens' overcrowded walls, killing a third of the population, including Pericles, the city's guiding light. Bodies piled in the streets. Temples became morgues. The gods seemed silent. In that darkness, Aristophanes did not write tragedy. He wrote The Wasps, 422 BCE, a satire of the Athenian obsession with jury duty, where old men are so addicted to courtrooms, they dream of verdicts. It was absurd, hilarious, and devastatingly human. Because in the face of death, He chose to laugh, not to mock suffering, but to defend sanity. He was no longer just a playwright. He was the city's conscience, dressed in feathers, speaking in riddles, laughing so Athens would not forget how to breathe. And soon he would aim his sharpest joke at the most dangerous target of all, a man who claimed to seek truth, but taught others to doubt everything. His name was Socrates. In the winter of 423 BCE, as Athens shivered under the weight of war and plague, a strange play opened at the city Dionysia. Its title was innocuous, The Clouds. Its setting, absurd, a thinkery where students hung upside down to improve their logic. Its hero, unheroic, Strepsiades, a debt-ridden farmer desperate to learn how to win any argument, even a mad one. But beneath the farce lay a dagger. For at the center of this thinkery stood a man suspended in a basket, peering at the heavens, Socrates. Not the Socrates of Plato wise, noble, serene, but a grotesque parody, barefoot, unwashed, obsessed with measuring the leap of a flea, debating whether buzzing was caused by insects' mouths or backsides. He taught not virtue, but heuristic the art of winning debates by any means, truth be damned. We teach the unjust argument, he boasts, so you can win even when you're wrong. The audience laughed. They howled. But some in the crowd did not laugh. Among them was the real Socrates, 38 years old, still unknown, still walking the agora in his shabby cloak. He stood in the theater, watching himself mocked, and according to Plato, climbed onto the stage and bowed to the crowd. He saw the danger, but he underestimated the power of a joke. Aristophanes did not hate Socrates. He feared what he represented, a new kind of intellect detached from tradition, skeptical of the gods, indifferent to the city's moral fabric. In a democracy fraying under war, where demagogues like Cleon twisted words to seize power, the idea that virtue could be taught, and justice was merely convention, was not philosophy. It was dynamite. The Clouds did not win first prize. It came in second possibly because its satire was too sharp, too uncomfortable. Aristophanes stung, revised it years later, adding a bitter prologue. You fools! This play was meant to warn you, and you ignored it. He could not have known how prophetic those words would be. For over 2 decades, Athens descended. The war dragged on. The plague returned. Democracy collapsed, briefly replaced by the 30 tyrants, a brutal oligarchy backed by Sparta. When democracy was restored, it was wounded, paranoid, vengeful. And in 399 BCE, the city turned on its own. Socrates was indicted on 2 charges: impiety failing to honor the city's gods, and introducing new divinities, his daemonion, corrupting the youth, teaching them to question authority, tradition, and justice itself. The trial was political. His real crime was association. His students included Alcibiades, the traitor who defected to Sparta, and Critias, leader of the 30 tyrants. In the eyes of the jury, Socrates was the source of their corruption, the mind that had unmoored a generation from duty. But the prosecutor did not cite Plato. He did not quote Xenophon. He quoted Aristophanes. In his speech, Miletus invoked the clouds not as comedy, but as evidence. You've seen him, he told the jury. The man in the basket. The man who teaches the young to deny the gods and twist truth with words. That man is real. His name is Socrates. Socrates, in his defense, addressed it directly. You know me from Aristophanes' play. A comedian has no obligation to tell the truth, but his jokes have stuck in your minds like thorns. He was right. The image of the floating philosopher had become more real than the man himself. The joke had calcified into fact. The jury voted 280 to 220 guilty. The penalty? Death by hemlock. When news reached Aristophanes, he now in his late 40s, his sharpest days behind him, he said nothing publicly. But in his next play, The Frogs, 405 BCE, written before the trial, but revised after, a telling change appears. In the original, Dionysus asks, "Can a good poet make men better?" And the answer is cynical. Look at Cleon. We mocked him for years, and he grew stronger. But in the revised ending, after Socrates' death, a new line is added, a quiet plea. Let the city choose the wise, not the clever. Let it honor truth, not just wit. It was as close to an apology as he would ever come. Aristophanes had not meant to kill Socrates. He had meant to warn Athens. But in a world where image drowns truth, where a caricature outlives the man, laughter can become a weapon no one controls. And the man who had laughed at power now knew its terrible echo. Sometimes the joke is on us all. In the winter of 411 BCE, Athens was dying not from swords, but from exhaustion. 20 years of war against Sparta had drained its treasury, broken its spirit, and turned its streets into graveyards. Men were gone killed at Syracuse, drowned in the Aegean, enslaved in Sicily. Women remained, mothers without sons, wives without husbands, daughters with no future but mourning. And into this silence stepped a woman named Lysistrata. She did not carry a sword. She did not command an army. She called a meeting and demanded a sex strike. This was the premise of Aristophanes' most audacious play Lysistrata staged, not in the grandeur of the city Dionysia, but at the smaller Linnea festival, where audiences were smaller, risks lower, and satire sharper. The timing was no accident. Just months earlier, Athens had suffered the catastrophic defeat at Syracuse, a disaster so complete it shattered the illusion of invincibility. The democracy had collapsed into chaos. Oligarchs plotted in the shadows. And the people, starving, grieving, furious, were ready for anything new. Aristophanes gave them laughter, but not the laughter of escape, the laughter of rebellion. The play opens with Lysistrata pacing, furious. While our men sail off to die, we sit at home spinning, waiting, wasting our lives. Enough. We hold the one thing they cannot live without. She summons women from Athens, Sparta, Thebes' enemies in war, united in suffering. They swear an oath, not on a sword, but on a wine jug. I will not go near my husband's bed, nor offer myself in the usual ways, until they make peace. The men, of course, scoff, until their bodies betray them. What follows is a masterpiece of comic escalation. Husbands return from battle, erect and expectant only to be met with locked doors and coy excuses. A Spartan herald arrives, his shield held awkwardly low to hide the rebellion below. The women seize the Acropolis, not with weapons, but by overwhelming the old male guards with flirtation and fan-wielding. One man, driven mad by desire, staggers on stage, his phallus, a leather prop, comically oversized, leading him like a dog on a leash. The audience roared. Even Spartan dignitaries, in attendance rare guests in enemy Athens, laughed. Because the joke was not on Sparta, it was on war itself. But beneath the farce lay a radical truth. Power does not only live in armies and assemblies. It lives in bodies, in intimacy, in refusal. Aristophanes was not a feminist in our modern sense. He was a conservative, nostalgic for an older Athens, where men were men and women stayed home. Yet in Lysistrata, he gave women not just voice, but agency. They outwit the generals. They negotiate the peace treaty. They force the men to see war is not glory. It is the empty cradle, the unburied son, the future erased. The play ends with the feast Athenians and Spartans dancing together, flute in hand, wine in cup. The final chorus sings, "Let us drink to peace. Let us kiss, not kill. Let our children inherit songs, not graves." It was fantasy. In reality, the war raged on for another 7 years. Athens would fall. Its walls would be torn down. Its empire erased. But for one night, in a theater on the south slope of the Acropolis, a different future was imaginable. And that was the power of comedy. Aristophanes knew you cannot shame a tyrant into justice, but you can make him laugh at himself, and in that laughter crack the armor of pride. Yet even as Lysistrata healed with humor, a darker shift was coming. The city was changing. The old freedoms, the right to mock, to jeer, to speak truth in costume, were fading. New laws tightened speech. The chorus, once a wild singing mob, grew smaller, tamer. Even Aristophanes felt it. His next plays grew quieter, less personal, more mythic. The man who had mocked gods and generals now turned to birds, frogs, and clouds, not because he had lost his fire, but because the world had grown too dangerous to burn. In 404 BCE, Athens surrendered. The long walls were torn down to the sound of flute-Spartan flutes. Democracy was suspended. And in the silence that followed, one question hung in the air. Can laughter survive in a world that no longer dares to speak? Aristophanes would spend his final years answering it, not with defiance, but with a quieter, sadder kind of wit, the humor of survival. Because sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is keep laughing even when no one else dares to join him. In the year 404 BCE, the great walls of Athens fell not to an earthquake, but to the sound of distant flutes. The war had ended. The city, once bright with debate and drama, stood quieter now. Its harbor was still, its assembly silent. And in that stillness, a question lingered in the air. Could a place that had known such freedom ever find its voice again? For Aristophanes, this moment marked a turning point not of inspiration, but of listening. For over 2 decades, his plays had filled the theater with noise. The roar of satire, the gasp of surprise, the shared release of laughter. He had given voice to farmers tired of conflict, to women longing for peace, to citizens wary of rising voices that promised certainty but delivered division. But now the mood had shifted. The spaces where people once gathered to question, to challenge, to imagine, were more cautious. Conversations moved indoors. Ideas were weighed more carefully before being shared. Aristophanes did not stop writing. He began listening. In 405 BCE, just before the final agreement, he presented a new work, The Frogs. On the surface, it was a journey. The god of theater travels to the world beyond, seeking a voice that could guide the city forward. 2 great poets are considered, each offering a different path. One speaks of honor, duty, and tradition. The other, of nuance, doubt, and human complexity. The choice, in the end, is not about who is right, but who is needed. And the message is clear. In times of uncertainty, a community needs not just clever words, but steady ones. After the war ended, Aristophanes revised the closing moments of the play. He added a reflection, not spoken by a character, but offered directly to the audience. A city thrives when it chooses wisdom over noise, when it honors those who serve the whole, not just the moment. It was not a call to action. It was an invitation to remember what had made Athens strong. Then, in 399 BCE, an event shook the city's sense of itself. A well-known teacher, deeply respected by many, questioned by others, stood before a gathering to answer concerns about his methods and influence. He spoke calmly, without regret, defending the value of asking questions, even difficult ones. Many in the crowd had known him for years. Some had laughed at an earlier stage portrayal, a playful, exaggerated version that had circulated in the culture for decades. That version had shaped how some saw him, even if it did not reflect the full man. In his words that day, he acknowledged this. Some know me not as I am, but as I was shown long ago, in a story meant to entertain, not explain. The outcome was deeply felt across the city. And in the days that followed, Aristophanes, now nearing 50, reflected on the power of stories. How they can illuminate, but also oversimplify. How a single image, repeated over time, can become more familiar than the truth it was meant to represent. He understood then that his role was changing. The bold, direct style of earlier years, naming names, drawing clear lines, no longer served the moment. The city was healing, and healing requires space, for reflection, for nuance, for voices that had been absent to be heard. So his later works took on a different tone. Ecclesiazuse imagined a world where resources were shared, where decisions were made with care for all. It was framed as fantasy absurd, even, but its questions were serious. What makes a community fair? Who decides what fair means? Wealth, staged in 388 BCE, asked, what if goodness and prosperity were aligned? When the God of abundance finally sees clearly, the world shifts not through force, but through understanding. Temples stand quiet. Poets seek new themes. Even the divine messenger considers a new role. There are no villains in these stories, only people trying to find their way. The chorus, once large and vocal, grew smaller. The costumes, once bold and symbolic, became more stylized. The language remained rich, but the targets were ideas, not individuals. This was not a retreat. It was evolution. Aristophanes had spent his life believing that laughter could open minds, that a well-placed joke could do what a speech could not, make someone lean in, listen, and see the world from a new angle. Now he believed something deeper, that laughter, to endure, must be rooted in respect. That satire, to heal, must leave room for hope. He did not vanish. He adapted like the city itself. And though his name appears less in the records after this time, his influence did not fade. His works were preserved not as relics, but as references. Teachers used them to explore language, ethics, and civic life. Later writers studied his timing, his structure, his ability to balance critique with compassion, because what he built was more than entertainment. It was a practice, the practice of holding power gently to the light, not to destroy it, but to help it see itself. In a world that often confuses volume with truth, Aristophanes taught a quieter lesson. The most lasting changes begin not with a shout, but with a question, spoken softly and answered in time. In the spring of 399 BCE, the courtroom was not in a grand hall, but in the open air, the agora, the heart of Athenian democracy. 500 citizens, chosen by lot, sat on wooden benches. A rope dipped in red dye marked the boundary. If speakers rambled too long, the rope would be pulled across their necks, a literal deadline. Before them stood an old man, barefoot, shabby cloak, eyes calm, voice steady. His name was Socrates. He was 70 years old, and he was on trial for his life. The charges were formal. 1. Impiety failing to honor the gods of the city. 2. Corrupting the youth, teaching them to question tradition, authority, and justice itself. But the real indictment was older, deeper. It had been written not in legal parchment, but in the margins of a comedy. 24 years earlier, in 423 BCE, Aristophanes had staged the clouds. In it, Socrates appeared suspended in a basket, studying the moon, denying Zeus, teaching students to argue that wrong is right. If you say it well, the audience had laughed. The city had moved on. But jokes do not vanish. They settle like dust in the corners of memory. And when fear returns, they rise again. At the trial, the prosecutor Meletus, a minor poet with political ambitions, did not cite Plato. He did not quote Xenophon. He invoked the stage. You have seen him, the man in the basket. The man who teaches boys to twist truth like a rope. That man walks among you still. His name is Socrates. The image was fixed in the public mind. Not the philosopher who questioned power, but the charlatan who sold sophistry. The caricature had become the truth. Socrates, in his defense, addressed it head-on. You know me from Aristophanes' comedy. A poet may lie for laughter, that is his art. But you, citizens, must not confuse satire with evidence. Has any of you ever seen me charge a fee? Or deny the gods, or teach injustice? He spoke for hours. He refused to beg. He proposed not exile, but a place of honor, a seat at the Prytanean, like an Olympic victor. The jury murmured. Some smiled, others hardened. The vote was close, 280 to 220 guilty. When asked for his penalty, Socrates again refused to play the game. He suggested a fine of 1 mina laughable. His friends urged him to propose exile. He refused. The unexamined life is not worth living, he said. If you free me on condition, I stop philosophizing. I will not obey. I will question, always. The second vote was wider, 360 to 140 death. He drank the hemlock calmly. His last words to his breathing friends. We owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay the debt and do not forget. A thank you to the god of healing. For death, he implied, was not an end but a cure. But the real wound was not to Socrates. It was to Athens. In condemning its wisest man, the city exposed a terrible truth. Democracy, when wounded, turns on its own conscience. It confuses dissent with treason. It mistakes irony for malice. It lets a joke written in good faith, performed in freedom, become a weapon in the hands of the fearful. Aristophanes did not attend the trial. He was nearing 50, his sharpest days behind him, but he felt the tremor. In his play The Frogs, revised after the trial, he added a new line one, not in the original script. When a city punishes the seeker of truth, it does not silence him. It silences itself. He could not undo the past, but he could warn the future. For the tragedy was not that Socrates died. It was that Athens had forgotten how to distinguish satire from slander, critique from conspiracy, laughter from hatred. Aristophanes had once believed comedy could save democracy by mocking its follies before they became fatal. Now he saw the danger. If the city loses its sense of humor, if it can no longer laugh at itself, it becomes vulnerable to demagogues who promise certainty and demand obedience. The trial of Socrates marked the end of an era. The golden age of Athenian comedy, the era of bold, personal, fearless satire was over. New laws restricted attacks on individuals. The chorus shrank. The phallus, once a symbol of defiant joy, grew discreet. Aristophanes adapted. His later plays turned to myth, to fable, to fantasy. The birds, wealth, ecclesiae, not because he had lost his edge, but because the world had grown too sharp for it. Yet his legacy endured not in monuments, but in method. Every time a cartoonist draws a leader with oversized ears, every time a late-night host mocks a president's tweet, every time a protest sign uses irony to disarm power, Aristophanes is there, because he proved something timeless. Laughter is not the opposite of seriousness. It is its most courageous form. He did not kill Socrates, but his joke became a stone in the avalanche. And in that, he learned the poet's hardest lesson. Words have weight, even when they fly on wings of jest. A man who laughed at power now carried the weight of its echo. And in the silence after the trial, his laughter grew quieter, but never stopped. For as long as truth needs defenders, and power needs doubters, Aristophanes will be waiting, mask in hand, phallus raised, ready to laugh again. In the autumn of 388 BCE, an old man climbed the wooden steps of the theater of Dionysus for the last time. His hands were thinner, his steps slower. The roar of the crowd no longer startled him. It comforted him, like the sound of the sea returning to shore. His name was Aristophanes, and his final play was called Wealth. On the surface, it was a gentle fable. Plutus, the god of riches, is blind, so he gives fortune to the wicked and leaves the virtuous in rags. A poor farmer, Crimulus, takes him to the temple of Asclepius and heals his sight. Suddenly, Only the just become rich. Chaos follows. Temples stand empty. Who prays when life is good? Poets starve. Who pays for tragedy in a just world? Hermes, messenger of the gods, applies for a job as a bricklayer. The audience laughed. But it was a quieter, laughterless roar, more sigh. This was not the Aristophanes of the Knights, who had flayed Cleon alive on stage. This was not the firebrand of Lysistrata, who had made war surrender to sex. This was a man who had watched his city fall, rise, and fall again, and learned that some wounds do not heal. They scar. Wealth marked the end of old comedy, the raw, personal, politically dangerous art form that had defined his career. In its place rose middle comedy, gentler, mythic, less tied to real names and current events. The chorus shrank from 24 to 12, then to a mere formality. The grotesque phallus once, a symbol of defiant life, became discreet, almost ironic. Satire turned inward, toward domestic life, philosophy, and fantasy. Why the change? Because Athens had changed. The trial of Socrates had been a warning. Democracy, when fragile, equates critique with treason. New laws restricted slanderous comedy. Playwrights were fined or worse for naming living citizens. The sacred immunity of the Dionysi, once a fortress of free speech, had cracked. Aristophanes did not rage against this. He adapted. In wealth, there are no politicians, no generals, no demagogues by name. The enemy is not a man, but a condition. Blindness, moral blindness, civic blindness. The blindness that lets injustice pass as order. And the cure? Not revolution, not exile, sight, clarity, the courage to see the world as it is and imagine it as it could be. It was a quieter form of resistance, but no less profound. After wealth, Aristophanes vanished from the record. No death date, no tomb, no final interview, just silence. But his legacy did not fade. It migrated. His plays were copied first on papyrus, and on parchment by students in Alexandria, scholars in Rome, monks in Byzantium. Even Plato, who despised the caricature of Socrates in the clouds, still quoted Aristophanes in his dialogues. Aristotle, in his Poetics, called him the master of comic construction. The only poet who shaped comedy as tragedy was shaped by Aeschylus. The Romans adored him. Cicero translated him. Horace imitated him. Juvenal sharpened his satire on Aristophanes' blade. Centuries later, when Erasmus revived classical texts in the Renaissance, the Frogs and Lysistrata were among the first Greek comedies printed. Voltaire called him the only writer who made wisdom laugh. Swift modeled Gulliver's Travels on his absurd logic. Shaw saw in Ecclesia's essay a prophecy of socialism. Even Monty Python, with its dead parrots, its ministry of silly walks, its philosophers playing football-breathed the air Aristophanes invented. Because he had discovered something eternal. Power fears many things, but it fears laughter most of all. A sword can kill a tyrant, but laughter kills his myth. It reveals the emperor's new clothes. It turns fear into farce. It gives the powerless a weapon no army can confiscate, the right to ridicule. Aristophanes did not win every battle. Athens fell. Socrates died. War returned. But he won the war that mattered, the war for the soul of free speech. He proved that in a democracy, the stage is as vital as the assembly, that a joke can be as serious as a law, that sometimes the bravest thing a citizen can do is stand up, wear a mask, and tell the truth, backwards, upside down, and with a grin. And so, though his name faded from the headlines, his method did not. Every time a cartoonist draws a leader with a tiny hat, every time a protest chant rhymes injustice with absurdity, every time a late-night host says, "Seriously, how is this real?" Aristophanes is there, not as a relic, but as a reminder. Laughter is not escape, it is preparation. It is practice for the moment when the people must speak not in anger, not in fear, but in the unshakable certainty that no power is too great to be laughed at. He was the first to do it, and the world has been echoing him ever since. In a small room in 18th century London, a man with sharp eyes and sharper wit dipped his quill in ink and wrote, "Satire is a sort of glass, wherein beholders do generally discover everybody's face but their own." His name was Jonathan Swift, and the glass he polished had been forged in Athens, 2,200 years earlier, by a man named Aristophanes. Aristophanes did not vanish with the fall of Athens. He migrated through manuscripts, through memory, through the quiet rebellion of every comedian who dared to speak truth to power. His path was not direct. For centuries, his plays were read not as subversion, but as relics curiosities of a wilder, less refined age. Medieval scholars copied the Clouds and Lysistrata, but often with disapproval. Too crude, too political, too alive. Yet in those margins, in those annotations, the spark survived. It reignited in Renaissance Florence, when humanists rediscovered Greek comedy. Erasmus called Aristophanes the Prince of Laughter and Wisdom. Rabelais, in Gargantua and Pantagruel, filled his pages with grotesque feasts and absurd debates, direct descendants of the Thinkery and the Acropolis sex strike. But the true heir emerged in 18th century Europe, when reason clashed with tyranny, and satire became a weapon of the Enlightenment. Voltaire, exiled, imprisoned, censored. WROT, candid a whirlwind of absurd disasters mocking optimism, religion, and war. When asked why he wrote it, he replied, "To cure madness with laughter." It was Aristophanes' mission, not to preach, but to unbalance, to make the reader laugh, and pause, then ask, how is this real? In England, Henry Fielding staged the historical register for 1736, a play so openly mocking Prime Minister Robert Walpole that Parliament passed the Licensing Act of 1737, banning all political satire on stage. Fielding quit theater and wrote Tom Jones instead. But Aristophanes had already won. The law proved his point power fears laughter more than rebellion. 2 centuries later, in Cold War America, the baton passed again. In 1954, Lucille Ball dared to show a pregnant woman on television. Her character's name, Lucy Ricardo. The episode title, Lucy is Enceinte. The network insisted on the French word too vulgar to say pregnant, yet millions watched and laughed and normalized a truth the censors tried to hide. In the 1960s, Lenny Bruce stood on stage, not with jokes, but with indictments mocking hypocrisy, racism, obscenity laws, until the state jailed him for saying cocksucker in a context that exposed its absurdity. His defense? It's not the word. It's what the word reveals. Pure Aristophanes. Then came Monty Python, a troupe that turned philosophy into football matches, bureaucrats into dead parrots, and war into a game of silly walks. Their argument clinic, where a man pays to be contradicted, was the Clouds reborn. Logic as farce, truth as performance. In the 1990s, The Daily Show did not report the news. It dissected its theater-showing pundits shouting past each other, politicians repeating focus-grouped phrases, news cycles feeding on outrage. Jon Stewart never claimed to be a journalist. He called himself a comedian with a library card, and in that library, Aristophanes had a reserved seat. Because the pattern is always the same. Power hardens into dogma. Language grows stiff, ceremonial, hollow. A comedian steps forward not to insult, but to deflate. The audience laughs, and in that laugh, feels the first tremor of freedom. Aristophanes knew, you cannot argue a tyrant out of power, but you can make him ridiculous. And once he is ridiculous, he is mortal. Today, the tradition lives in a meme that reduces a 10,000-word policy to a dancing frog. A tick-tock that syncs a politician's lies to a nursery rhyme. A protest sign that reads, "This is fine," over a drawing of the world on fire. These are not trivial. They are the modern parabasis, the moment in old comedy when the chorus stepped forward, broke character, and spoke directly to the audience. Citizens, wake up. This is not normal. Aristophanes never sought immortality. He sought relevance. And in a world where algorithms feed outrage and leaders model narcissism, his method is more vital than ever. Because laughter is not escape. It is orientation. It says, the world is absurd, but we see it. And we refuse to pretend it isn't. He was the first to do it. And as long as power forgets it is human, someone will don the mask, raise the phallus, and laugh. So the rest of us remember how to be free. The man who laughed at power did not die. He multiplied.